The resurrection and exaltation of Jesus. In this final lecture in our New Testament survey, I want to look at the resurrection and exaltation of Jesus and just say a few things about it, rather than explore all the different references to the resurrection and exaltation of Jesus in the New Testament. So one of the things I want to look at is the background idea, and in particular, the use of the Old Testament in understanding the resurrection and exaltation. One thing we can say is that the disciples were surprised by Jesus' resurrection. There was no Old Testament passage that said the Messiah will die and then be resurrected from the dead. But rather it's after the fact of the resurrection that the disciples return to the Old Testament and see what they can see. Now, let's begin, though, with a broader aspect of this discussion and look at the background of the very concept of resurrection in Judaism. And the first thing to say is that the Sadducees simply did not believe in it. They couldn't find it in the books that they considered canonical, the first 5 books of the New Testament. The Qumran community does not speak of a resurrection. There is the idea in several passages in the community rule in 1QH about the idea of a habitation of the faithful with the angels. And that may possibly refer to life after death. We do know from Josephus that the Essenes believed in life after death, even though they didn't speak of resurrection. Now, the Pharisees carried the day for the majority of Jews. The Pharisees did believe in a resurrection, as most people did in Israel in the 1st century A.D. And they believed in a coming judgment. They believed in an eternal reward in the coming age. What about the Old Testament and life after death? There are several passages that could be pointed to, and notice they're not coming from the first 5 books of the New Testament here. In Isaiah 25:8 we read, "He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth." In Job 19:25 and 26 and 7 we read, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, then my flesh, from my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me." Psalm 49:15 says, "But God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me." And Psalm 16, verse 10, an important psalm for the early Christians, when speaking of Jesus, says, "For thou dost not give me up to Sheol, or let the godly ones see the pit. Thou dost show me the path of life. In thy presence there is fullness of joy. In thy right hand are pleasures forevermore." What about the idea of resurrection itself in the Old Testament, not just life after death? Isaiah 26 says, "Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead. Come, my people, enter your chambers, and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the wrath is past. For the Lord comes out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth will disclose the blood shed on it, and will no longer cover its slain." Here you have the idea of resurrection and judgment together. The clearest reference to resurrection in the Old Testament can be found in Daniel 12. "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Then verse 13, but go your way till the end, and you shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Hosea chapter 6 says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn that he might heal us. He has stricken, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us know, let us press on to know the Lord. His going forth is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. This passage in particular has sometimes been referenced in terms of the idea of Jesus being resurrected after 3 days. And then also from Hosea chapter 13 we read a statement, shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your destruction? A passage that is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. It is represented in the RSV translation as a statement, not as a question. Now, in the intertestamental Jewish period, we find a number of texts referring to the time of the resurrection. And here we see a development from our Old Testament passages because there's more reference to resurrection in the Second Temple material. So, for example, in 2 Baruch 30 we read, then all who have fallen asleep in hope of him shall rise again, and it shall come to pass at that time that the treasuries will be opened, in which is preserved the number of the souls of the righteous. And they shall come forth, and a multitude of souls shall be seen together in one assemblage of one thought. And the first shall rejoice, and the last shall not be grieved. For they know that the time has come of which it is said, that it is the consummation of the times. But the souls of the wicked, when they behold all these things, shall then waste away the more, for they shall know that their torment has come, and their perdition has arrived. What evidence is there for Jesus' resurrection? Now, this course is not a course on Christian apologetics, but I would like to say 2 things about this. Firstly, there's the empty tomb. There is no record that anyone expected Jesus to rise from the dead, or that the tomb would be empty. As I said before, the Old Testament passages are not clearly pointing to this kind of an idea. The empty tomb, secondly, is a problem as much as it is a testimony for the early church. The reason for that, it can be found in the actual note on this subject in Matthew 27, verses 63 and 64. The natural assumption would be that the body had been stolen by the disciples. If the church had wanted to invent a story about the resurrection, they could have done a lot better job in the invention than to present, for example, the testimony of women, and grieving women at that, as evidence of the resurrection from the dead. They could have had stories of faraway places where Jesus appears to great crowds, but instead what we have is Jesus appearing to a few of his disciples, as though this is just an internal testimony and not something that you could point to and say, see, he really was raised from the dead. So the empty tomb is problematic, and yet it is also evidence for Jesus' resurrection. In fact, the very point that it is somewhat problematic on its own is evidence in favor of the fact that this is indeed what the disciples discovered. Now, the empty tomb relates to the next point then. And the next point is the point about the resurrection appearances. There are about 11 separate occasions, and what I'm going to present in the next several slides is a table that shows these resurrection appearances in the extant documents and references that we have in the New Testament. There are resurrection appearances in both Jerusalem and in Galilee. There are appearances to individuals, to groups, and to large groups, but they are disciples. There are appearances, but not simply visions or apparitions. They're able to touch Jesus and see him eat. There are appearances that come to an end with Paul seeing the risen Jesus. And then finally, Jesus' body is a resurrection body. That is, Jesus is not simply raised from the dead in some way of that we can't relate that to the actual teaching of the coming of the resurrection, but rather it is understood as the first fruits of the expected resurrection. In other words, today we live in the time of the resurrection because it's already begun when Jesus was raised from the dead. And it's the fact of Jesus' resurrection, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that we know that the rest of the resurrection is going to take place, which will be our resurrection one day. Now here are the passages that speak of the resurrection appearances. And there are some similarities and some differences. And this is not the lecture where we will discuss this in detail, but rather I want to present the evidence as we have it over the next few slides. Now, to understand the New Testament's teaching on the resurrection, we also have the Old Testament and how it is used. Acts chapter 2, verses 25 through 32, quotes from Psalm 16, 8 through 11. Here Peter is explaining what's gone on the day of Pentecost, and he says, "For David says concerning him," the Messiah, "I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue rejoiced. My flesh also will dwell in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence." Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Here we see Peter referencing Psalm 16. It is clearly a reference to a resurrection of God's Holy One, but it's just vague enough that it wasn't so clear to the disciples and others that this was something that would have applied to a Messiah who would be crucified and resurrected. That whole event of the death and resurrection of Jesus took the disciples by complete surprise. And it was a teaching that was unique to the early church, that is indeed what God had intended. The final two slides of this lecture have to do with the ascension. And what I want to point out here is that we don't simply have the death and resurrection of Jesus, but we also have the ascension of Jesus. And more could be said on this subject as well. For example, in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, Paul begins with Jesus' pre-existence, and then his incarnation, and then his crucifixion. And then he moves on primarily to talk about Christ's ascension. But let's see what we can find in terms of the Old Testament and the idea of the ascension. As Elijah ascended and left a double portion of the Spirit with his disciple Elisha, so Jesus ascends and gives the Spirit to his disciples. Jesus' departure is associated with the giving of the Spirit, and his departure is an ascension, just like Elijah's. Acts chapter 2 again, Peter on the day of Pentecost. Peter says, David did not ascend into the heavens, but he himself says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And in that, Peter is quoting Psalm 110, verse 1, which is one of the most important psalms for the early church to interpret Jesus. Verse 36 of chapter 2 in Acts says, let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. So Jesus' ascension is not just his departure, but it is his exaltation to divine authority, using Psalm 110. He therefore overcomes his enemies and empowers disciples for worldwide mission. With that, we end this lecture and the course of New Testament survey.